I'd like to start by asking the question, what is sound? Sound is the way our senses perceive vibrations in the air. These vibrating air molecules are constantly knocking into each other, looking somewhat like this. They're bunching up in clusters, over time expanding, bunching up again, and so forth. The study of physics calls the air molecules' behavior compression waves. This event here, being compacted, and this event opening up, is known as rarefaction. So if a tree drops in the woods but no one is there to hear it, does it make a sound? Let's think about that for a minute. Compression waves will still be emitted all around that tree, but no one would be there to perceive it as sound. And sound is our evolutionary perception of these compression waves. Just as light and color are evolutionary perceptions of photons being reflected from surfaces. So how do we perceive sound? Let's start with the ear. We can divide the ear into parts, starting with the outer and middle ear. Now again, this isn't an anatomy class, so I don't expect you to memorize all of this, but I'd like you to have a certain understanding as to what goes into how we hear sound. The sound is directed into your ear by this piece of cartilage, known as the pinna. This also helps you in detecting direction in which the sound is traveling from. Further in your ear is a thin membrane called your eardrum. It's surrounded by wax for protection. The eardrum then vibrates, transferring those vibrations to three bones called ossicles, which then in turn disrupts a fluid in the cochlea that reacts with sensory cells to send electrical impulses to your brain that is perceived as sound. This video does a great job explaining it.
Ears are constantly active. They pick up sound waves and change them into information that the brain can interpret, such as music or speech. Sound is a pressure wave that can vibrate either quickly or slowly. Slow vibrations produce deep sounds, while quick vibrations produce high-pitched sounds. Sound enters the ear and is directed through the ear canal, where it first reaches the eardrum. As the eardrum begins to vibrate, it sets the ossicular chain in motion. The ossicular chain consists of the hammer, anvil, and the stirrup. Sound vibrations move along the ossicular chain and into the inner ear. Within the inner ear, the cochlea plays a central role. It is here that the mechanical energy of sound is converted into complex electrical signals, which are then passed on to the brain. In simplified terms, the cochlea is a spiral-shaped tube filled with fluid. Sensory cells, also called hair cells, line the entire length of the cochlea. These hair cells have varying degrees of sensitivity for the detection of different tones or frequencies. This allows the ear to perceive the entire spectrum of sound. The change from mechanical vibration to electrical pulse is a complex process resulting from the movement of hair cells in the cochlea. Along the entire length of the cochlea, the hair cells are arranged like the keys of a piano. Hair cells located at the base or lower region of the cochlea are responsible for high frequency, while hair cells at the apex are responsible for the low frequencies. As the fluid in the cochlea is set in motion, it causes a corresponding movement of the fine structures on the surface of the hair cells to take place. These movements cause tension differences which produce electrical signals that are passed along the hearing nerve to the brain. The auditory cortex of the brain interprets this information as sound, for example as music or speech. The entire chain of events, including the various steps that convert sound waves from the environment into information that the brain can interpret, happens so fast that individuals can hear sound both continuously and instantaneously. Within this complex chain of events, there are a number of factors which can cause an individual to experience hearing loss. A loss of hearing can range from a mild to moderate hearing deficiency to a total hearing loss. In general, there are three main types of hearing loss which differ from one another depending on the part of the ear that is affected, be it the outer, middle, or inner ear.
So that is quite an impressive amount of happenings in such a short amount of time. The whole process is not only transferring energy, the energy undergoes a transformation from acoustical to mechanical to electricity almost instantaneously and within your own head. The sound is a part of our everyday life, so we take it somewhat for granted. We are simplifying it as vibrating air molecules, but it is so complex. Now this slide further visualizes what was represented with the slinky. These compression waves travel an average of 1,130 feet per second at room temperature. The first property of these air molecules we'll look at is sound pressure. Let's use this slinky to physically represent a series of compression waves. You could see the springs or air molecules bunching up and spreading apart. The moment just before the slinky recoils back from my right hand to my left hand, there is the most force against my right hand before returning to an equilibrium. And then once the springs in my right hand are completely spread apart, the spring pulls on my hand, creating what's known as negative pressure. If we were to look at this two-dimensionally, if anyone has experience with pre-calculus, you'll probably remember learning about wave functions such as sine waves. This is an introductory course, so we won't delve too deep into the mathematics, but this is something you will see over and over again, so it's a concept that must be fully comprehended. We'll start with two variables, time and what we were just discussing, pressure. So this point, where the x and the y-axis meets, we'll call 0. So if you recall, where the slinky was all bunched up in my right hand, it had the greatest positive pressure against it, pushing my right hand, but when it was stretched out, my hand was being pulled. Now in between, I mentioned there was an equilibrium. There we have our points to connect, creating a sine wave representation of the slinky, or air molecules. Now I'm going to take these two PVC pipes and hit them together. What happens as I increase the pressure in which I strike? It gets louder. The pressure in sound waves equates to loudness, or sound pressure level, abbreviated to SPL, measured in decibels, or dB. As a representation of a waveform, the farther away from equilibrium the graph stretches, the greater the amplitude or the loudness measured in decibels. Measuring from the highest point to the lowest point is called peak-to-peak measurement. There are a few common tools in which we measure decibels for different reasons. The first, pictured here, is simply called a decibel meter. This allows you to measure ambient acoustics. For example, a local jurisdiction may want you to keep a concert below a certain limit. The decibel meter can tell you how loud the concert actually is. Picture next to that is called a volume unit, or VU meter. Most commonly seen in analog recording gear, this allows you to meter signal processing, or input or output level. For example, a compressor may have a VU meter showing how much gain is being reduced after compression. Preamps may have a VU meter to show how much signal is going in and again how much is being sent on the output side. Metering input and output gain will help you to maintain a proper gain stage along the way, as well as keep preamps from clipping. We'll go over that further in other lessons. The next is an LED meter. Now, this is essentially a digitized VU meter that is representative of a colored bar as opposed to a swinging needle. Now again, decibels is an arbitrary unit of measurement to scale. The units do not, however, increase intensity linearly, but instead algorithmically. Think of 40 to 50 decibels as a quiet room, 60 decibels as a moderate conversation, and 100 decibels would be a loud rock concert, and 120 decibels would be on the threshold of pain. Now 120 decibels would begin to cause permanent damage. But two groups having a 60 decibel conversation next to each other doesn't equal 120 decibels of conversation. It would make it impossible to go anywhere. Instead, every 3 decibels is actually twice the sound pressure, but is not perceived to be twice as loud until you reach 10 decibels over the source. The faster sound waves move, the higher the pitch that is created, and vice versa. Looking linearly at a graph sound wave, pick a starting point. It will cross that point 3 times after hitting its positive peak and negative peak amplitudes. This is known as a cycle. The number of cycles that occur in 1 second is the wave's frequency, which we measure in Hertz, abbreviated Hz, or 1000 Hertz is known as a kilohertz, abbreviated KHZ, or sometimes just K. Perfect human hearing ranges from 20 Hz to 20 kHz, with upper frequencies being lost over time. Dog whistles can produce frequencies over 20K, thus inaudible to humans but completely audible to other species like dogs, who have the ability to hear far beyond 20K. Octaves are created by doubling frequencies. If anyone was in high school band or have an old tuner at home, you probably remember tuning to a sustained beep sound called A440. This is because 440 Hertz is actually a note A. If we double that frequency, we would have A880, an octave above A440, and so forth. We can use a real-time analyzer, or RTA, shown here, as a tool to see the frequency spectrum and analyze what is going on. As a mixer or musician, it is important to be able to distinguish frequencies, or at least ranges of frequencies, through audible characteristics. I'm sure everybody has been in a car and wanted to adjust the tone in terms of bass, mid, or treble. It is the same concept here, but we can further subdivide the bass, mid, and treble. This chart shows roughly where instruments and certain characteristics lie in the frequency spectrum. Notice where the fundamentals lie. The high up highs and low lows are A, not necessarily the focal point in our hearing, and B, not where most instruments lie. These are called harmonics, which I will be going over in just a bit. Take notice of the subjective qualities described: honk, thump, fullness, and attack. You can't quantify these descriptions, which is the palette of colors in which an engineer or mixer uses to create an effective mix. Now let's look at this graph. On the y-axis, we have increasing frequencies in Hertz, and the y-axis is decibels. This is graphing what's called the perceived loudness scale. This charts the volume frequencies need to be at in order for humans to perceive as even. This is due partially because of evolutionary traits. The center of our hearing is quite even. You'll notice a little dip in the upper mids around 3K. So this means we actually have a bump in our hearing in this area, actually more so in women. It just so happens that this is also the fundamental of a baby's cry. Frequencies outside of normal speech need more energy, as humans simply don't perceive the frequencies with the same energy. Notice at greater volumes, our ears naturally compress the dynamic range of the full frequency spectrum. Now, this is not to say those frequencies have less energy. We spoke earlier about how a 3 decibel increase doubles the acoustical energy, but we don't perceive it as so. The lower frequencies actually require much more acoustical energy than the mid-range frequencies. If we were to use a decibel meter, at a flat response, it would register the sound as much louder than humans perceive it to be. This is why we use a technique called A-weighting to respond to human perception. It ignores much of the low-end energy and focuses more on the mid-range for an accurate perceived loudness measurement. The next characteristic of sound we could look at is velocity. Now, does anybody know the difference between speed and velocity? Speed is how fast an object is moving, calculated as speed equals distance traveled divided by time traveled. Velocity is the speed in a given direction, or velocity equals distance over time. So what's the difference? One can drive a car at 60 miles an hour, but in a zigzag fashion. After 1 hour, it only makes it 30 miles. So while the speed of this car is actually 60 miles an hour, the velocity is only 30 miles per hour. Likewise, a car traveling a speed at 120 miles per hour, moving in the same zigzag pattern, would really be traveling at the same velocity as the car driving at a speed of 60 miles an hour in a straight line. When we refer to speed of sound as 130 feet per second, it is actually velocity. The most common professional use of this knowledge is in applications such as delaying speakers and microphones for proper phase correlation. We will dive deeper into the topic of phase later in this course. There is a stipulation, however. 130 feet per second is the average speed at room temperature, 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Velocity increases roughly 1.1 feet per second, every degree raised. This is because of the less dense air as the molecules are spread apart. There is less friction to slow down the trajectory of sound. There are other variables as well in calculating the actual speed of sound in a given time and place. Using the velocity 1,130 feet per second as a standard, calculations are then based on sound traveling 1 millisecond or 1/1000th of a second per foot. That is an important number to memorize. Now, timbre is the special characteristics in sound that help our brains distinguish the sound source. This is why a friend can call you on the phone and you can recognize who it is. You can also tell apart, for example, a flute from an electric guitar playing the same notes. Even though the pitches are the same, it would be quite obvious to distinguish the instruments, all because our brain links timbre to the sound source. Timbre also helps you recognize direction of sound and what kind of acoustical space you are in. Even blindfolded, you'd be able to distinguish someone singing in a church versus a small bedroom because of the sound's timbre. Timbre is comprised of two characteristics, being the sound's envelope and its overtone series. Now, the envelope of a sound can be broken down further into four separate parts: attack, decay, sustain, and release. You may sometimes see it abbreviated to ADSR. This makes up the basic waveform. Attack would be the initial hit of the instrument. It starts from the absolute start point of the sound through the run-up to the peak amplitude. That is followed by the decay, which is the subsequent rundown of the attack time, to the level at which the note or the sound is sustained. Sustained embodies the main duration of the sound until the pitch is stopped or changed. The release is comprised from the time it takes for the sound to cease after the sustain. I'm going to take some examples of different instruments and alter one or more of these four pieces that make up the envelope. The second component that makes up the sound's timbre is its Overtone Series. The Overtone Series is a product of simple physics. When a note is played on an instrument, there are multiple other pitches adjacent to the perceived pitch, but at a lower level. These notes are called the Overtone Series. The levels at which the overtones created resonate and how they interact with each other vary from instrument to instrument. If you play an A3 on, say, piano, it is perceived to be only that pitch 220 Hertz. The A you hear, the strongest frequency, is the fundamental. To find each successive overtone, you multiply that frequency to determine what we refer to as harmonics. For example, the first overtone is the original 220 Hz, times 2 is 440 Hz, one octave above the fundamental. The next overtone is 220 Hz times 3, which is equal to a perfect fifth above A440, or E660. The next note in the series is 220 times 4, then 220 times 5, and so on. As the overtones get higher, the intervals become smaller, each overtone being a multiple of the fundamental frequency. This is also the basis for Western harmony. So now, I asked before, if a tree falls in the woods and no one was here to hear it, would it make a noise? We discussed and came to the conclusion that compression waves would be emitted all around the tree, but no one would be there to perceive it as sound.